Well, Israel has now arrived in what's known as the wilderness of Sinai. They're camped at the base of Mount Sinai. As Pastor Rob shared last Wednesday, God's magnificent presence has descended on the mount in a thick cloud and thunderings and lightnings. And Moses he goes up the hill and he gets instructions and he comes back down and he gives them to people. He goes back up the hill and he gets more instructions, comes back down. And so Moses must have been in good shape, 80 years old. He's climbing up and down that mountain. And he's talking with God, bringing back word. God has much to teach the people, but the first lesson that they need to learn is that God is holy. He's not to be trifled with. And so the message that Moses repeatedly keeps giving the people is, listen, don't touch the mountain. Stay in the valley, listen to what God has to say, but don't presume to run up the mountain and to meet with God. He is holy and you need to honor his holiness. And so God has sent Moses back down the mountain to warn the people again. Listen, tell them not to touch the mountain. Moses says, God, you've already made that clear. They're not supposed to. He says, Moses, get down the mountain. Tell them again. And so while it's down, Moses is down there telling the people again, listen, don't touch the mountain. Don't go up. That's when we find then the events of chapter 20. So look at what it says in verse 1. And God spoke all these words saying. So now keep in mind, please, everyone hears what follows. The Ten Commandments are what's coming now, and they all hear it. It isn't just Moses that hears it, and then he brings it back. God speaks these words, and the entire nation of some 2 to 3 million people hear these words. Verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now we get the Ten Commandments. Each commandment is worthy of its own message, if not each command having a series of messages. In fact, the last time I taught through the Bible, we looked at each command over 10 Sundays. And I would encourage you, if you've never done an in-depth study on the Ten Commandments, go to the website, go to the studies menu, and look up the studies that we did, and listen to the messages or read the notes that are there online. And do your own in-depth study. If you've never done one, it's very profitable. The first commandment now, I'm just going to make really summary remarks over the Ten Commandments. The first commandment is in verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me, God says. While the rest of the world believed in and worshipped a plethora of deities, Israel was to worship and show sole devotion to the single authority of Almighty God. The second commandment, verse 4, and you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that's in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, Yahweh your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. So they were to craft no object by which to worship God, no idol to represent him. Now, what he says here about the generations, visiting iniquity on children of the third and fourth generations and showing mercy to thousands, to those that love him and follow his commandments, he's going to repeat that later, and we will go into depth on it when we get to that passage. The third command, verse 7, you shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. God is holy, so they were to show reverence for him by never using his name in a casual or a profane way. Fourth commandment, verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who's in your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Hallowed means to set something apart as special. Pastor Rob did a masterful job elaborating on this 2 Sundays ago. If you weren't here, I would encourage you to get a copy of the study in the bookstore or go online and listen to it. Really great exposition of how we honor the Sabbath day. Now, Again, the Sabbath is going to get a much fuller treatment later as God uses it in a special way with the people of Israel in their covenant. So again, we'll cover it in depth then. Now, according to ancient Jewish tradition, the first 4 commandments were written on the first of the 2 tablets that comprised the 10 commandments as the finger of God. He speaks these to the people, they hear them, but then he writes them on 2 stone tablets. And so the first 4 commandments are contained on 1 tablet, and the other 6 commandments are contained on the other tablet. You will notice that the 10 commandments do seem to be divided into 2 groups. Those commandments detailing our responsibilities towards God, and those detailing our responsibility towards other people. Do you remember how Jesus once was speaking, and some opponents came to him, and they again challenged him, and they brought up this question that was popular at the time. In fact, it was kind of the main question and debate that went on in religious circles. And the question was, which of the commandments is the greatest commandment? Remember when they came to him, they said, Jesus, which is the greatest commandment? Jesus' response was interesting. You could probably all say it with me. The greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And what? To love your neighbor as yourself. On this, Jesus said, hang all the law and the commandments. Well, think about it. The commandments are divided into our duties to God and our duties to man, right? Jesus says the greatest command is love God. If you're going to love God, you're going to keep all of his commandments, aren't you? And if you love people, you're going to obey all the rest of the commandments. And so these things really do summarize all of the commandments. So we could look at the 10 commandments really from the perspective of one thing: love. Love. Man, there it is. Well, the 5th commandment's in verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days, note that, may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Man, it's so hard for me not to want to preach on each one of these. There's so much there. 6th commandment, verse 13, you shall not murder. 7th commandment, verse 14, you shall not commit adultery. 8th commandment, you shall not steal. 9th commandment, in verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. We took a look at that on Sunday. The 10th commandment, in verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, his female servant, his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Now, as I said, entire series have been done on the 10 commandments. Thick books have been written with each of the commandments getting its own chapter. And again, if you're a new believer, new to these things, I would encourage you really, if there's a passage of Scripture you want to study in depth, it's the 10 commandments. They form the heart and the core of the law. But let's summarize the 10 commandments this way. Look at that word honor that begins the 5th commandment in verse 12. See what it says there? It says, honor your father and your mother. That's the Hebrew word chabad. It's sometimes translated as glory. And it's used to describe the brilliance that surrounds the manifestation of God. It's a word that speaks of light, of radiance, of brilliance. But here's what's interesting about that word in Hebrew, chabad. The root of the word means weighty, that which presses down. The root of the word is that it speaks of something substantial, something that is so real it has weight to it. How many of you remember the hippies? See, if you raise your hand, you obviously weren't one, right? Because if you were a hippie, your memory's blown. It said if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. Do you guys remember the hippies had a saying? Do you remember what it was? When they would hear something that was mind-blowing, they would say, ooh, man, that's heavy. Heavy, bro. Heavy, man. And it was a word that they had come up with. I think it really kind of came more out of the beatnik era, and the hippies kind of adopted it. But man, it just meant you were hearing something that was like, whoa. It was mind-blowing, you know. It was paradigm shifting. It was heavy. It was heavy. Yeah, that really kind of gets at the idea of this word Chabad. There's weight to it. There's substance to it. Do we not oftentimes think of the spiritual realm as being kind of ethereal and abstract and fanciful and fantastic? Don't we? The glory of God, the word is Chabad. Weighty, heavy, real, substantial. Friends, listen. It's the spiritual realm that's higher and eternal. This physical realm is contingent on the spiritual realm in which God dwells eternally. It's this realm that's light and fanciful and changing and temporal. It's the realm that God dwells in that's real and weighty and substantial. So that word honor that's used here, when it's used in this context, it means this. Honor your father and your mother. Another, recognize their weight. Respect them and their position and their assignment by God. You're to show due respect for them. You're to honor them. You're to reverence them as you do the Lord, whom God gives you, parents, to help teach you about obedience and authority. Parents are kind of God's stand-in when we're young, aren't they? They represent authority. They're the ones that teach us. They're the ones that raise us. They're the ones that provide for us. They are the source of life for us. And so parents stand in the place of God when we're very young, but their goal is to teach us to ultimately obey God, to obey Him. And so we are to honor our parents. Now that word comes right in the very center of the Ten Commandments. And if we were to look at each of the commandments from this idea of honor, we could cast the Ten Commandments this way. The first commandment says that we are to honor Yahweh alone as God. No one else is to call the shots in our life. The second commandment means that we are to honor God as transcendent and not confuse Him with His creation. We must never pollute our knowledge of God with lesser things. Can I get an amen? The third commandment means that we are to honor Yahweh's holiness, right? Don't take the Lord's name in vain. We're to honor His holiness. The fourth means that we are to honor the special relationship with Him. Think about it. You're to honor the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it what? Holy. What are you not to do on it? Work. Rather, you are to rest. Now, we work because we believe that it's by our work that we'll earn stuff so that we can survive. And God is saying, listen, ultimately, it's me you're dependent on, not yourself. And I have called you into a special relationship with me, so take a day off every week to just meditate upon your relationship with me. Honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. The fifth commandment, honor parents and the unique role they play in teaching us about God. The sixth commandment, honor the sanctity of life. Seventh commandment, honor the sanctity of the covenant of marriage. The eighth commandment, honor the sanctity of personal property. The ninth, honor truth. And the 10th is a call to general honor of others by respecting that they're called to be stewards of what God has given them. And we're not to envy what they have. We are to honor others and what they have. Well, verse 18. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, you speak with us and we will hear, but let not God speak with us lest we die. I guess so. Confronted with this awesome display of God's glory and hearing His voice announcing His will is simply too much for the people. They could not hear the Ten Commandments without being struck about how they had already so badly broken them. And so they plead with Moses to intervene. He would be the go-between for them and God. You know, many people, probably most people, have thought, maybe regularly think, man, if I could just see God, if I could just hear God, what a boost to my faith it would be. You ever thought that? If you ever thought that, raise your hand. Raise your hand. Come on, everybody raise your hand. Come on, at some point, haven't we all said, man, if I could just see you, Lord. If I could just see your presence. What a boost to my faith that would be. Oh, to hear God speak. I think that this should put that to rest, what we're reading about here. The people see God. They see His glory on the top of the mountain. They hear Him. And what do they say? Moses, can you go up there and talk to God and bring it back? Because it's too much for us. It's too much. Later, Moses himself is he's going to say to God, God's going to say, Moses, you know, you've done such a great job. What do you want? Remember what Moses says? Lord, show me your glory. And God says, Mo, I can't. If I were to show you my glory, it'd kill you. It'd be too much for you. Here's what I'll do. The best I can do, I'm going to stick you in this little cave over here. I'm going to put my hand over it, and as I pass by, once I'm passed by, I'll pull my hand away, and I'll let you see. And really what God is describing is, you know how when the sun goes down over the horizon, you can't see the sun anymore, but you can still see the light of the sun shining up above the horizon? It's the afterglow of the sun. You're not seeing the sun itself. Can you stare at the sun? No, it'll make you blind, right? But you can see the light of the sun illuminating the sky. That's what God is saying He'll let Moses see. Moses, you can't see me, it'll kill you. But I'll let you see the afterglow. Oh. When the prophet Isaiah is given a glimpse of heaven, he sees the hem of God's robe. It says the train of His robe. It means the hem, if you will, of God's garment. Again, it's just the afterglow. And what happened to Isaiah? This holy man, it wiped him out. It wiped him out. He's on his face, crying out, I am undone. Literally, I'm coming apart. He was dying. John was given those amazing revelations of God on the island of Patmos. He was wiped out. He fell as though he was dead. Daniel was made so weak by the glory that he encountered, it took him days to recover. Friends, seeing God isn't something frail humans can endure. But do you realize seeing God is what we're destined for? That's why we have to trade in these frail things and get new bodies. Because these would never make it in heaven. They're too frail. So we're going to get new vehicles. And we'll be able to see God face to face. And we will realize in that moment when we look into His eyes and see Him looking into ours, this is what we were created for. Here the Israelites are being confronted with the reality that Yahweh is nothing like the deities that are worshipped by other nations. He's the true God and all the others are frauds. Verse 20, and Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, and that His fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. The people realized that they had already busted every one of the commandments. And so they're thinking, what's next? Judgment? But Moses calms them by saying that they need not fear God. Rather, what they ought to fear and steer clear of is sin. God doesn't want His people to be terrified of Him, but He does want them to simply honor Him by respecting His holiness. And they can do that by keeping the commandments. Verse 21, so the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. Then the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, you have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make anything to be with me, the gods of silver or gods of gold, you shall not make for yourself. So God repeats the second commandment with its prohibition of making an idol because he knows how prone the people were to do just that. It's what every other group and every other religion did. The Israelites would embrace their radical difference from the ways of the rest of the world. You know, friends, it's the nature of worship to become incarnational. That is, worship struggles for expression. It really does. That which we truly worship will find expression in our lives. If we're not careful, we can equate the form of our worship with the thing that we're worshiping. The ancients would take a log or a stone and they would fashion it into an image that they would attribute to their god or their goddess. And when they originally made it, their thought was, no, this isn't the actual god or goddess that we're worshiping. It's just a representation. It's just an image that we use to worship by. And they didn't think at first, oh, this is the god, this is the goddess. Rather, it's just his or her representative. But it wasn't long before the image itself came to be thought of as the deity. God warned his people to never make an image of him because it would confuse them about who and what he is. By its very nature as a created thing, an image is always less than the Creator God. An image distorts our understanding of him. And that understanding has a direct impact on our relationship with him. An image is the product of our mental factory called the imagination. Before we fashion an image with our hands, we've already fashioned it in our minds, haven't we? There's a danger in trying to imagine what Jesus looked like. He was a man, but I would caution you on imagining what Jesus looked like. Isn't it interesting that in the Scripture, there's no description given of Jesus? We have 4 Gospels, and yet he's never described for us how tall he was, how long his hair was, what color his eyes were, his complexion. We have no description of Jesus. You think maybe that's a hint by the Holy Spirit? We're not supposed to try to imagine what he looked like? By the way, that picture you have in your wallet, that's not Jesus. All right? The Holy Spirit doesn't want us conjuring imaginary portraits of Christ because that would inevitably confuse us and shortchange who and what he really is. And yet, as I said, our worship strives for incarnation. It strives for expression. That's why in John chapter 4, Jesus said, true and pure worship is offered in the Spirit and in truth. Through the communion of our spirit with God's Spirit through his Word. There is an indispensable link between the Spirit, the Word, and genuine worship. While they were not to fashion an image by which to worship God, they could use a place to worship him. So God now gives instructions on how to build that place. Verse 24, an altar of earth you shall make for me. And you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I record my name, I will come to you and I will bless you. And if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stone. For if you use a tool on it, you've profaned it. Nor shall you go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness may not be exposed on it. Sacrifices were to be a part of their worship, which needed an altar. If you're going to make a sacrifice, you need an altar. And so God tells them how to make it. And it is to be it's to be a plain affair. It's to be plain. If it's made of dirt, they are simply to just make a mound. If it's made of stone, they are to use unworked rocks. In other words, they aren't to use any artifice in making it. No elaborate artistry. Because the attention is not to be on the altar, it's to be on the sacrifice that's made on the altar. Not the religious furniture it's laid on. God wanted them to be mindful of the substitution the sacrifice made, not the skill of the artist. And that's why the altar was to be at ground level rather than elevated. It was to be something that all could draw near to, not reserved for some special class of holy men. If the altar was elevated, approached by stairs, as the pagan altars universally were, the people would get a disgusting upskirt view of the priest, which would ruin the whole affair. All the attention was to be on what happened on the altar, not around it. And friends, listen, all of this points to the cross, does it not? A simple, humble time and place where the final sacrifice that all previous sacrifices anticipated and pointed to was made in the death of Christ. Contrary to the popular idea, the cross of Christ was not on top of a hill. It was at a hill, but not on top of it. The word that's used in Scripture for the place that Jesus was crucified is called Golgotha, translated into the Latin as Calvary. You'll remember that in the Gospels it's called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, or translated into Latin, and then it's Latinized in the English form of Calvary, which is interesting because that means you go to Skull Chapel. It's going to be our new logo. It's going to be a skull. No, it's not. I'm kidding. Skull Church. Where do you go? What church do you go to? Skull Church? Romans, crucifixion was a Roman execution. Romans used crucifixion, and by the way, remember that Roman citizens were not crucified because it was considered too disgusting and demeaning a way to die. So to preserve the dignity of Rome, no Roman citizen was ever crucified. They were beheaded if they needed to be executed. It was only for foreigners. And the Romans used crucifixion as a way to both terrorize people, but also as an example. So they didn't crucify people on the top of a hill. They crucified people along the side of busy roads where people could see up close and personal what happens when you mess with Rome. If you go with us to Israel, we'll visit Jerusalem and we'll take you to Gordon's Calvary. Right next to Gordon's Calvary is an Arab bus station. The back of the bus station, their parking lot, is a cliff, an ancient quarry that the people of Jerusalem used to carve out their limestone to build their buildings. Archaeology has proven that there was one of the major roads that came into the north side of the city passed right in front of that cliff. The ancient quarriers had dug out limestone of the cliff, and when you sit there and you look at it, when the light is right and the shadows are on the cliff, it looks like a skull from here up. 2 eyes and the nose. It's right at ground level. And it's like this hill, it's like this skull leering over the road. Christ's cross was not on top of the hill, it was in front of the hill with the skull leering over the scene of death. It was a simple place. It wasn't on top of a hill. It was right there where people could walk by. Remember, it says people came up to him, they spit on him, and they cursed him, and they said, hey, come down from that cross. It was right there as the people were passing by. And so God says when you make an altar, it's to be just a plain, simple affair. The emphasis is to be on what happens on the altar, not the altar itself, not all the religious hullabaloo that goes on around it. All of this points at the simplicity of the cross, where the substitute was made for you and I. It's what happened on the cross, not all the stuff around it that's important. Now, Israel spends the next year camped at Sinai, and during that time, God gives them the law. The word Sinai means thorny. The area was also called Horeb. The local people called it Horeb, which means desert or desolate place. God brought Israel to Mount Thorny in the desolation to give them the law. Isn't it interesting that just after giving the Ten Commandments, before he gives them the rest of the Mosaic law, God tells them how to make an altar. Because the altar is for those who break the law. The law is holy, it's right, it's good, but friends, we are fallen, we break the law. And when our conscience is pricked by the thorns of the law and we feel guilt, it's by going to the altar that guilt is removed. If we try applying more law, what happens when you mess up and you think, man, I just need to apply more law? What happens? You end up feeling desolate. The law has no power to save us. It only serves to drive us to Christ. As Paul says in Galatians, the law was a tutor that drove us to Christ. The law makes no one righteous. On the contrary, it shows that we aren't, and it sends us to relief to the cross where Jesus died for us. So I love this. You have the Ten Commandments, and then you have these chapters where God goes on and gives this highly detailed law, and right in the middle of it is build an altar and keep it simple. Now after this, Moses goes up onto the mount to meet with God, receives what we find in chapters 21 through 23, which is called the Book of the Covenant. And remember that the people had asked Moses to be their go-between. That's what he does here. He goes up on the mount, he records everything that God says, and then carries it back down to the people. What we need to understand is that this is precisely the way the ancients believed that things worked. Every major kingdom had a law code which they believed had been given to them by their chief deity to their first great ruler. That's what made him their first great ruler, was that he's the one that had received from their deity, whoever that deity was, this special set of laws that formed them as a society. You guys have heard of Hammurabi? Hammurabi's law code. He was the first great Babylonian leader. Well, there's this stela of him, and there's a picture of him receiving this law code from the chief Babylonian god, Bel. And to this day, Hammurabi's law code is held by many historians as the first great law code. Well, this predates it by quite a lot. Here is God really kind of using the forms of that day, and he's giving to them a set of laws. The difference is this. Whereas in the other groups, the other societies, it was their deity giving it to their first great ruler. It's God himself who is the ruler of these people. Yes, he gives it to Moses, but let's remember, who heard the first part of the law? They all heard it. God gave it to all of them. Because God is their king. God is their ruler. Moses is going to receive the rest of it and help implement it, but really God was their monarch. So on the mount, Moses gets a detailed and elaborate set of civil, moral, and ceremonial laws governing Israel for the generations to come. Jewish rabbis counted 613 specific laws in the Mosaic Law, and chapters 21 through 23 contain many of them. Really, what we find here is an elaboration on the implications of the Ten Commandments for the members of the covenant community. If the Ten Commandments are the skeleton of God's law, these chapters are kind of the muscles and the ligaments. So look at verse 1, chapter 21. Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. That word judgments means that what follows is case law for deciding civil cases that will be brought to the judges of Israel. So really what we are about to read, these are the rules that will be used when people come to court. The judges are going to use this as the basis for deciding court cases. Okay? Verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. God begins by laying down rules governing the treatment of servants. I so appreciated the songs that Rob picked tonight. Guys, let's remember, this group of people that's here, what have they just been? Slaves. And as God now gets into kind of the details of the law, the very first thing he talks about is slavery. If you look at all the other law codes, guess who the law codes start with? the king and his rights. They start with people at the top of society, and eventually they work their way down and get to the people at the bottom of society. God says, okay, listen, I'm going to use kind of the same form that the other people are using, where the God gives the people their laws. But I'm going to turn the thing on its head. We're going to start with the people at the very bottom of society. We're going to start with the servants and with the slaves, and we're going to talk about them first. I love that. I love that. He tells them that they are to recognize that servants are not property, objects like the rest of the world saw them. They're people created in God's image for His glory, not man's. Now, friends, slavery is an emotional and highly charged topic. But as with everything else, we need to set it in its proper historical setting. When we think of slavery, we tend to identify slavery in terms of our own nation's history prior to the Civil War. We think of African slavery and the plantation economy of the South. That was a brutal and oppressive system of exploitation. But please understand that that is not characteristic of the majority of slavery throughout history. Not by a long shot. In the ancient world, when almost all economies were based in agriculture, and most people lived off the sweat of their own brow and what they could grow or what they could trade, slavery was an institution that's very different from what it was at a few points in history. A household might have one, maybe a very prosperous household might have as many as 2 slaves who were vital to the family's economic health. And because of that, they were generally treated pretty well. Almost like members of the family because of the intimate relationship they had with the master and his family. Most slavery was small scale. Again, 1 or 2 slaves, not masses of them. It was at rare times in history when slavery became more massive, when one master owned dozens or possibly even hundreds of slaves, or worse, when slaves became the property of the state. That's when slavery becomes dehumanizing. It happened in Egypt with the Israelites. It happened in the Roman Empire, of course, we know about that, and in the plantation economy of the South. But what we find in the law of Moses was unheard of, simply unheard of in the ancient world, that slavery was to be a limited state. God puts a cap on it. How many years can somebody be a slave, does he say here? 6 years. Why? Because slaves are not to be regarded as property. They are human beings who ideally ought to be free. They ought to be free. Slavery was merely a condition, something that someone might fall into for any number of reasons. The main reason in this economy was because they fell into debt. They simply could not pay their debts, so they would serve for a time to retire their debt, and God is putting a limit on it. Maximum of 6 years. And then they need to go free in the 7th. But a lot can happen in 6 years, and so the law goes on to stipulate some additional rules. Verse 3. If he comes in by himself, that is, as a slave, he'll go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. So when the 6 years of servitude were over, the servant went out as he came in. If he was a single guy, he went out single. If he was married when he came in, he took his wife with him into freedom. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, a further rule is added to this. When the servant was released, the master was obligated, I love this, to give him a gift of tools and seeds so that he could start life on his own. So he doesn't start out in debt. He's going to be right back in servitude again. No, give him the means to be able to go out and get planted and live a productive and a self-supplying life. Verse 4, if his master has given him a wife, and she's borne him sons and daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he'll go out by himself. Now that seems harsh, doesn't it? But there was nothing in the slave's term which he said he had to take a wife. If he did, he knew the risk of having to leave them under the master's rule or of redeeming them once he was free. So what about the servant who decides to serving his master is actually better than being free. What if he's so in love with his wife and his kids, he can't bear the thought of going out without them? Well, God makes provision for that as well, verse 5. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife and my children, I will not go out free. Well, then his master shall bring him to the judges. Remember, again, this is all case law for the judges. He'll bring him to the door, to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. An awl, not an owl. It's like a short little stubby screwdriver. It's got a point on it. You use it for putting holes in leather. Okay, it's an awl. And so the idea is they're going to take this servant, they're going to take him and they're going to take him to the doorpost, and they're going to put his ear there on the doorpost, and they're going to take the awl and they're going to push it through, typically down here. They're going to push that through the lobe of the ear, and they're going to pin him to the doorpost. Literally attaching him to the household, you see? Literally attaching him to the house. This decision by the servant was not to be motivated by debt or obligation, but out of love for his master. If the servant decided to stay and commit himself willingly to the master, then in the presence of witnesses, he would be taken to the door of the house and attached to the house, literally. And then when the awl was withdrawn, guess what they did? They put a ring in it. They put a ring in the ear. That's where the earring, the custom of the earring comes from. It was a sign that you had attached yourself as a bond servant. You are now bound to your master. The servant then wore that ring as a badge of honor and distinction. He's a bond servant, a bond slave permanently attached to the house of his master. In Psalm 40, verse 6, this image of the bondservant is used as a picture of the Messiah. Listen to this. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire. My ears you have opened. Now, unfortunately, that's a bad translation, the word opened. It should be, my ears you have pierced. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, Paul says of Jesus, he made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bond servant and coming in the likeness of men. You see what we have in this picture of the servant who, out of love, attaches himself to his master? It's a beautiful picture of Jesus. The last time in the book of Exodus we read about a door, what was it? Do you remember the last time we read about a door? What happened there at the door? Passover. It's when the blood was put on the doorpost. Jesus is our Passover lamb. I want you guys to think about this. Here is God who is free, who comes to earth and becomes one of us to pay our debt. We who were slaves to sin and death. And he came into that identity to identify with us. And his blood was shed, and it was put, as you will, if you will, symbolically on the doorpost, so that the destroyer would pass over us and we would not be destroyed for our sins. And Jesus, he came to earth and he could have gone out free. But instead, he went through the doorway of death. Why? Out of love for you and me. Because we were his bride. And he says, I don't want to go out without them. And so there is that doorpost covered with the blood that Jesus then goes to. And he was pierced, but not his ear, his hands and his feet, as he's attached to the wood of the cross, where his blood was shed. Do you see the picture of the cross? Where our Passover lamb was pierced for us, so that he could redeem his bride and ultimately set us free. What a great picture. Now, verses 1 through 6 are applied to male servants. A different rule was given for women, and there's a reason for it. We'll see here in a minute. And if a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food or clothing or her marriage rights. And if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go out free without paying money. The law commanded that a man who'd become a slave to pay his debts should be set free in the 7th year. No such law of manumission was given for female slaves, for a very good reason. This wasn't a case of prejudice, friends, it was a case of protection. Female slaves usually became the concubines of their masters. Once a woman had been a concubine, she was unlikely to find a man willing to marry her. And a single woman in that culture that did not have a husband that was providing for her was typically going to be in a very bad state. There was no one to provide for her. So this law provided protection for female servants. Some Hebrew fathers thought it more advantageous for their daughters to become concubines of well-to-do neighbors than to become the wives of men of their own social class. If a daughter who became a servant wasn't pleasing to her master, she was to be redeemed by a near kinsman. But she could never be sold to a foreigner, because foreigners would make her a slave for forever and treat her poorly. She was allowed to redeem herself among the Hebrews. If she married her master's son, she was to be given family status. If the master married someone else, he was required to provide her with the three essentials of food, clothing, and shelter. This idea of women, and especially women of the lower social and economic classes, having such rights respected by God and society, was simply revolutionary in an age when women were regarded as little more than property. So I realize that what we're reading about here does seem kind of harsh, but you need to understand, in the light of the times, this was a radical up for the women of that time. Verse 12, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. So God establishes the principle of capital punishment in the case of premeditated murder. But he makes a distinction between premeditated murder and accidental death, or what we know as manslaughter. He says if someone dies accidentally, then the person who's responsible, the one that caused that death, they can flee to a place of safety, of refuge, where their case will be heard to see that, in fact, it was an accident and wasn't premeditated. The cities of refuge are something that will be set up later. We'll study about that. But if it's proven that the guy actually was committed murder premeditated, he did it with intent, he's to be executed. Verse 15, he who strikes his father and mother shall surely be put to death. There you go. There it is. You got any kids that slap you? You can off them. No. That word strikes here is to be understood in the same way as verse 12. It means a blow that's meant to kill. This is to be regarded as a grievous violation of the fifth commandment, honor your parents. The man who violently rebels against his parents is left without judgment, if he's left without judgment, introduces a moral and a spiritual infection into society that's going to work great harm. Verse 16, he who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he's found in his hand, he's going to be put to death. Kidnapping is a capital crime. Verse 17, he who curses his mother or his father shall surely be put to death. Oh my goodness. Wow. Hey, listen, that's an extension of verse 15. Now, don't think this means that some 9-year-old that disses his parents gets his head lopped off. That's not what that means. This referred to those sons and daughters who consistently adopted a posture of defiance and rebellion that made life in the home a nightmare. Also, teenagers. Also, remember that all of this is guidelines for the judges of Israel in deciding cases that come before them. Please understand that. This isn't stuff for parents to say, "Oh, LaVerse here, I get to kill you because you rolled your eyes when I told you to make your bed." And that's not what this is. No, think about this. You're a judge in Israel. You have parents that bring, and typically this is an older child that is showing defiance and rebellion and making life a nightmare. By the way, does that happen in isolation or like neighbors witnesses to that? Remember, these people, they live in houses right next to each other, okay? And so you got the judges of Israel, and you have these parents that bring this child, and who's the first person the judge is going to look at? The parents. Whose responsibility is it to raise kids? It's the parents' responsibility. So the parents come with this accusation against this kid. The judge is going to be like, "Well, tell me about how you raised this child." The judge isn't all over the kid first. It's, "Well, you have primary responsibility. Tell me about life in your home, what's been going on." And he'll hear all the case and determine what is justice. Remember, all of this aims at justice. There's no prejudice involved here. And by the way, above it all is the sanctity of human life. So are judges willy-nilly telling people to, go ahead and kill their rebellious kids? Of course not. Of course not. Please understand that. Verse 18. If men contend with each other, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted. He shall only pay for the loss of his time, and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. So a man who's hurt in a violent encounter was to receive compensation for the time lost due to his injuries, as well as to have his medical bills paid. Makes sense, right? It's reasonable. Verse 20, if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall be punished. This rule was meant specifically for foreign slaves, not Hebrew servants, who were covered in verses 1 through 11. A Hebrew servant who was always treated in the light of the fact that he would be set free. Foreign slaves were a different matter. They were not set free. What we find in verse 20 was a radical departure from the laws of that time. Please understand this. In the ancient world, if you had a slave, that was your property. You could do whatever you wanted with them. Whatever. You could kill them. And the law would do nothing because they're property. God is saying here, no, this is a human being. You kill your slave, guess what, buddy? You've taken a life. And what happens? Your life is forfeit. Verse 21, notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. This exception to verse 20 is given because it speaks to the issue of intent and falls under the principles that were set out there in verses 12 through 14. The master who intended to kill his slave would be put to death. If the slave lived a few days, it meant that it was not his intent of the master to kill him. If it was intent to kill him, he would have killed him. In such a case, the loss of the slave and the role that he performed in the house would be considered enough of a punishment for the master. Verse 22, and this is interesting now, watch this. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished according to as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, well, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Damages resulting from violence are to be assessed against the guilty parties. These judgments must be just and equal to the damage. An eye will pay for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so on. This is what's known as the principle of lex talionis, equal law. Please understand that what we find here is not a license for revenge. It's a limitation to it. See, listen, it's human nature. If you slap me on the cheek, if you slap me, I'm going to get even with you by slapping you on the cheek and punching you in the gut. Because you need to know, you get back what you gave me, but I'm going to punish you for discomforting me in the first place. I'm going to make you pay. So you slap me in the cheek, I slap you in the cheek, punch you in the stomach. So you punch me in the stomach and poke me in the eye. And I poke you in the eye and bite your ear off. Okay? And it just keeps going. And so what God is saying to the judges of Israel, no. It's eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You don't keep escalating the violence. How many of you can say amen? Don't escalate the violence, right? Isn't this what we do when we argue? Like at home, it gets hotter. Like, you're an idiot. Well, you're an idiot and a jerk. Well, oh yeah, well, that, and on we go, because we keep escalating, right? So these rules were meant to assist the judges of Israel in assessing the right judgment to make when damages resulted from violence. Note verse 23. If violence causes a pregnant woman to miscarry, the perpetrator has committed murder and is to be executed. Right? The moral schizophrenia of our society is made clear. When a woman who is driving in her car to have an abortion gets in a car wreck and she miscarries, or let's say she gets in a car wreck and she's killed, the guy who's responsible for getting in the wreck with her can be charged with murdering 2 people. But she was on her way to the abortion place. The schizophrenia of our society over this issue is absurd. Let's be clear. Life begins at conception, not birth. I need to finish up this chapter. We're out of time. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant, destroys it, he shall let him go for the sake of the eye. If he knocks out a tooth of his male or female servant, let him go because of the sake of the tooth. Please understand these verses reveal the real texture of slavery in Israel. Do you realize in that God looks like he's looking for just about any reason to let slaves go free? Right? It's like God is, I don't like slavery, so I'm going to find any reason whatsoever to find out to let slaves go free. So you have some master, and they get physical and they pop some slave in the mouth and they spit out a tooth, and that slave can go to the judges now and say, look at that. The judge says, you're free. Your debt's paid. You can go free. It's like God is looking for any opportunity to set people free. Verse 28, if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned. Its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. Oxen can get pretty feisty and were known to rear their heads and impale people. Any ox which killed someone was to be put down. Verse 29, but if the ox tended to thrust with its horn in times past, it's been made known to his owner, but he's not kept it confined, so that it's killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner is to be put to death as well. Some oxen have a dangerous disposition. They attack anyone that comes close. If such an ox is not kept tied up, the owner shows a disregard for human life. So if his ox does kill someone, it's like he's committed the murder. Verse 30, if there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life, whatever is imposed on him. Whatever it has gored a son or a gored a daughter, according to this judgment, it shall be done to him. So once the judges have heard the case, they may decide there's not been enough firm evidence that the owner of the deadly ox was criminally negligent to the point of being guilty of murder. In that case, he'll have to pay a fine, and the judges will assess the fine. Verse 32, if the ox gores a male or female servant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So that, again, that's for a foreign slave. A Hebrew servant would be treated as a freeman, and so would fall under verse 28. Verse 33, you can tell I'm trying to get done here by 8:30, and we're not going to make it. If a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, well, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to its owner, but the dead animal shall be his. It's okay. If one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox they shall also divide. Or if it's known that the ox intended to thrust in time past, and its owner is not kept it confined, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. So, what's the point here? Would you agree God's getting pretty detailed in his instructions here on how to handle this? Can you understand that the principles that God is giving very specifically here can be applied to other things? It's this principle, let's lay out a law for this, and then use your head to figure out how that would apply to these other issues. The point is this: these rules convey the idea of being careful with the property of others. Be careful with the property of others. Let me say it again. Be careful with the property of others. When you park your car in the parking lot, be careful that when you open the door, you don't smack the car next to you. When you are finished unloading the shopping cart and you put the groceries in your car, don't just push the shopping cart away and watch it roll into that brand new 2017 Lamborghini that's parked over there. Be careful with the property of others. May I suggest that applies to the shopping cart itself. That belongs to that market. How about when you get out of your car and you walk up to the store, why don't you take an empty cart with you? I'm meddling now. I'm just meddling.